Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jennie Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
And last week I did promise that we would get the dates and times correct for the annual Gilpin County Cemetery Crawl up at the Central City Cemeteries. So this year, it will be on August 26th. It begins at 11 a.m. It will be in the Knights of Pythias Cemetery. And you can purchase tickets if you're local and interested in attending. Tickets can be purchased through the Gilpin County Historical Society, and they have a link on their website. Tickets are $15 per person. And I would get your tickets sooner rather than later because this event does sell out every year. So if you are planning to attend, now is the time to get your tickets, or you might miss out on being able to go. They do have to, it's a big cemetery, but it's not that big. And so They have to limit the number of people. And also if you've never attended, you go in groups from person to person. And so they limit the size of the groups so that, you don't have 100 people trying to stand around listening to one person talking in the middle of the cemetery. So, if you are interested in coming to that, like I said, August 26th, 11 a.m., get your tickets now at the Gilpin County Historical Society website. And hopefully, as one of the reenactors, I will see you there. I'm excited. I love doing this every year. I got my person last week. I read through her a little bit, and she lived to be over 100 years old. So I know I get to talk about like a whole century's worth of stuff for her. So I'm excited on that one.
Very cool.
Today, we have with us a very special guest. This is her first time coming onto the show. I actually met her through the Association for Gravestone Studies conference that we just had last month here in Denver, and listened to her talk on today's topic. Was super fascinated by it, so I reached out, emailed her, and we are super excited to have Joy Giguere. Welcome to our show. Joy, tell us a little bit about yourself first and how you even got interested in cemeteries to begin with.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on the show today. I'm really excited for this. I've never been on a podcast before. I barely only just became acquainted with podcasts through my kids, actually. So this is a totally new thing for me. So I'm an associate professor of history at Penn State York in York, Pennsylvania. So we're one of the Commonwealth campuses of the Penn State system. And my area of research interest and expertise focuses on American commemorative culture. So that includes grave markers, cemeteries, public and private memorials and monuments. And in terms of the roots of all of this interest, I guess it goes back to my undergraduate years, where at Bowdoin College, I was an anthropology major focusing on archaeology. And so I did an archaeology field school, which you do if you're planning on doing that. And my field school was in Wales and Ireland. Oh. And so it was 6 weeks. We did 2 weeks in Wales doing excavations. And then we did 2 weeks in Northern Ireland doing geophysical surveys and graveyard surveys of these Irish churchyards. And it was my first time experiencing historic grave markers from the 18th century. And I just thought they were so darn cool with these skulls and crossbones and hourglasses and bells. And they were just fantastic. And I loved them, and I thought they were just absolutely fascinating. And so when I started my master's in historical archaeology at the University of Maine, and I had to start thinking about what should I do a thesis on, I thought back to my experience in Ireland. And so I told my advisor, okay, I think I want to look at gravestones here in Maine and see what we've got, if we've got anything interesting here. And my advisor, in his hilarious way, went, gravestones, how are you going to make that archaeological? And I said, well, Dietz and Datelifson did it, and so surely so can I. And the funny thing is, he worked with Dietz at one point, so I was like, come on, man. And so for my master's thesis, I cataloged about 1,200 pre-1820 gravestones in Cumberland County, Maine. And so that's a county, that's the county that I'm from originally, that includes the city of Portland. And so for my master's, I really focused on the 18th, early 19th century stuff. And then when I stayed at UMaine for my PhD in history, I shifted more into the 19th century and found inspiration in my future husband's residence in Cairo, Egypt, to study the Egyptian revival in the United States. You know, we were walking around Cairo and I see all this Egyptian revival and I'm like, well, it makes sense here. But why do we have so much of it in the United States? Why do we have so many obelisks and pyramids and temple facades and stuff like that? And so I wrote my dissertation on the Egyptian revival and its connection to the formation of national identity, and its use in commemorative culture in the 19th century in the US. And that became my first book, published through the University of Tennessee Press in 2014, which is now available in paperback and ebook from the Tennessee Press website. And so really I've focused increasingly on 19th century cemeteries and grave markers. And the materials that I've been most recently working on, and what you saw my presentation on at the conference, are part of my second book that's coming out through University of Michigan Press in 2024, called Pleasure Grounds of Death: The Rural Cemetery in 19th Century America, where I look at not just the history of the rural cemetery movement during the 19th century, but primarily focusing on the ways in which the living used these spaces and engaged with these spaces, and oftentimes fought over these spaces. That cemeteries were not very simple and straightforward. They were often highly contested cultural landscapes where people really disagreed over how these spaces ought to be used and what they meant to different classes of people. And like during the Civil War era, you have like border states like Kentucky, where you've got both pro-Unionist and pro-Confederate sympathizers, and you've got both Confederate and Union soldiers being buried in the same rural cemeteries, and you have the civilians kind of rubbing it in each other's faces over whose graves are being better decorated and cared for. So they become spaces for contest over shows of loyalty during the Civil War, and places where we see that early formation of public history and public memory of the Civil War. So they're more than just burying grounds. There's a lot going on in terms of what the living are doing with them throughout this period of time.
That's what I found super fascinating about your talk that you gave. I guess those of us who have been interested in cemeteries for a long time, we're all familiar with the rural cemetery movement and how we moved out of the grave or the churchyards and things into the rural cemetery. But I never really gave the politics of it much thought until I was listening to your talk, and I was like, oh, that makes a whole lot of sense why certain things, and especially in certain cemeteries, are the way they are, because there was a lot of politics happening in these cemeteries. So, and this, I think you told us during your during your talk, that this is really what we're talking about today is really one chapter of your new book coming out. So there's a whole lot more in your book that I'm super excited about. So I can't wait till it comes out next year so I can read the whole thing. But what you're really focusing kind of on today is sort of the changes in the rural cemetery movement from when it began and what it was initially supposed to be to how it changed really in a matter of decades. It seems like there was a really quick turnaround in what people were envisioning initially to what it became within, a sort of a 60, 70 year period. That's my understanding from reading your paper and listening to your talk.
Yeah, so the rural cemetery movement has its roots in the first decades of the 19th century. So by the end of the 18th century, a lot of the older colonial churchyards and public burying grounds were already becoming overcrowded. Right. And New Haven, Connecticut was really the first major town in the new republic to start thinking about burial reform and what that might look like. There had been waves of yellow fever epidemics in the 1790s. And the residents of New Haven, they had their old burying ground, which was only about maybe an acre, slightly over an acre in expanse. And so it was a private resident of the city that provided At first it was about 6 acres, then expanded to 7, then 8, and today it's about 18 acres in extent.
Wow.
These places, they expand over time, but,
Right.
but at 6 acres, the new burying ground in New Haven was the largest burying ground in the country.
Wow.
And it was probably larger than virtually every burying ground in Europe as well. 6 acres was huge for the time period. And in its design, it really reflected the neoclassicism of the federal period, the desire for linearity, straight lines, order. So you have these very straight carriage paths, you have planted trees at regular intervals to provide shade and pleasing aesthetics. And it really became a tourist attraction. And it opened up the idea of this is a new reform cemetery model. And I'm using the historian Dale Upton's language for this. He really talks about New Haven as creating the first of what we might call reform cemeteries.
Right.
And there are a number of these reform cemeteries that are established kind of scattershot around the country through the 1820s. And New York City experienced its last major yellow fever epidemic in 1822 when the city shut down all of the city burying grounds, but then they ran into the problem of what are we going to do instead?
Right.
And so there are all these proposals of, well, let's buy land out in Jamaica Plains and put a cemetery there, and let's put something in Brooklyn, or let's put something here or there. And everyone's like, nobody wants to travel that far. And yet at the same time, it's like, where are we going to bury the bodies? So
Right.
you have all these people breaking the local ordinances of burying bodies because where else are you going to put them? And so while New York is kind of tinkering around with figuring out, well, what are we going to do now? Dr. Jacob Bigelow in Boston, in 1825, he brings together a group of influential men, including the statesman Edward Everett and Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story and General Henry Dearborn. And these are the men that form the Massachusetts Horticultural Society.
Right.
And he says, we need an extramural burying ground. Boston has managed to escape the ravages of yellow fever and all these awful epidemics, but we don't really want to tempt fate because the medical community, they adhere to the miasmatic theory of disease during this time, that disease, epidemic disease especially, is spread through miasmas, corrupted air. And what creates corrupted air? The bad smells of decomposing bodies in overcrowded burying grounds. So they form a cemetery association and they purchase this 72-acre plot of land in Cambridge. Originally called Sweet Auburn, and it had been used for years as just a wild open space for running around and hunting and everything else by students, faculty, and staff at Harvard University. And these men buy the Sweet Auburn plot and they change the name to Mount Auburn. And Henry Dearborn, he becomes really kind of the nation's first landscape architect.
Right.
And he modifies the land, the pre-existing landscape, to include carriage and footpaths. He creates artificial ponds. He takes out a number of trees, but then plants other trees. So he creates a landscape that mimics untouched nature, but is very much touched by the artifice of the human hand. And this becomes the nation's first quote unquote rural cemetery. It's rural by design. It's suburban in location. So this is where we get the term rural cemetery. It's about the design of the landscape rather than its location. It's not out in the sticks.
Right.
It's near the cities, but just outside the city. So it wasn't that difficult for people in Boston to get to, especially if you had a carriage or a horse, but it was still even a walkable distance.
Okay.
And so Mount Auburn opens and is consecrated in September of 1831, and it is immediately a national sensation. First of all, 72 acres blows away New Haven's 6 acres
Right.
in terms of space. And for us today, we visit cemeteries, and I'm sure so many of your listeners visit cemeteries on a regular basis. And we're used to walking into a cemetery and it's absolutely lousy with monuments. There are monuments everywhere.
Yep.
monuments on top of monuments. But when Mount Auburn was first established, there were no monuments. It was this beautifully picturesque landscape that people were allowed to go to and hang out in. And it took a few years for monuments to be erected. And so Mount Auburn took on this dual function of being both a public park and a burying ground. It was going to be expansive enough so that there would be no worries about overcrowding of burials. They were going to erect a massive carriage gateway and enclosure around the cemetery so that they wouldn't have to worry about vandals or grave robbers, which was a serious concern during the 19th century. So it was going to be secure, it was going to be safe, it was going to be, it wasn't going to be overcrowded. The ideals of the founders was that anybody of any class could afford to be buried there. You could buy family lots for $60 for 300 square feet, or you could buy a single burial lot for $10. That meant that even working men could afford to be buried at Mount Auburn. So we have these egalitarian ideals here. And in a time where the first industrial revolution is starting to really take hold, and we're getting more overcrowding in the cities, we have more disease, we have more industrialization that's causing sounds and smells and all this other stuff that's unpleasant, Mount Auburn becomes a retreat so that you can escape from the city for an afternoon and go there. And so the founders and social commentators, they have all of these thoughts on how people should be using this space. That it should uplift the morals and make people think upon the eternity of death. And they talk about the pleasures of melancholy, and that people should inherently understand how to behave in a space where the dead are going to be buried, that you have to be reverential, that you have to be respectful, that you shouldn't be racing your horses or hunting the wildlife.
I love Victorian ideals.
Picking the flowers.
It hasn't changed in some aspect. It hasn't changed.
That's true.
And so this is where we really kind of get into the first major conflict over how the rural cemetery is to be used, because you have the ideals of the founders who really kind of trust the public to know what they're doing. And then you have the public who they're so excited and so enthusiastic. They just use this space how they see fit. And then the founders kind of go, oh no.
What did we start?
People are picnicking here. We don't want that. People are picking flowers and they're breaking tree branches and they're racing their horses and carriages. And that's not how you're supposed to use this space. So because Mount Auburn is still kind of the first and only one, the Board of Trustees, they start creating lists of rules and regulations. Because this is a testing ground. This is a total social laboratory of figuring out, well, okay, if we're going to have a massive cemetery, that's also going to be a park-like space. What are the boundaries in terms of what's considered acceptable? So Mount Auburn has a lot of responsibility, and its trustees, in terms of working out the kinks of how people are supposed to use this space. And within just a few years, we start to see new rural cemeteries. So Mount Hope in Bangor, Maine becomes the nation's second in 1834. And then we have Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, which always claims to be the second, but is actually the third. Sorry, Laurel Hill.
They're close in dates.
They're established in 1836, and New York finally gets its kinks worked out. And by the end of the 1830s, Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn opens up, and that becomes the largest by far. I think at its opening, it was already over 200 acres. It was massive. And so Mount Auburn, Laurel Hill, and Greenwood, they become kind of the holy triumvirate of the early part of the rural cemetery movement. Mount Auburn is distinctive because it's the first. Laurel Hill is distinctive because people think it's the most picturesque, that it's the most lovely, even though it's also the smallest. It was only about 32 acres when it opened. And Greenwood is distinctive because it's the largest. It's the most expansive. And so as the rural cemetery movement expands across the country, a lot of communities, they're thinking about those three as the principal models.
Right.
But where it gets really interesting is when you get outside the Northeast and cemetery founders start to realize we don't live in the Northeast. We don't have, you would think that that would go without saying.
Right.
But there's this realization of we don't live in the Northeast, and therefore our rural cemeteries aren't necessarily going to look exactly the same as the Northeastern ones. We don't have the same kind of topography. We don't have the same local flora. We don't have, the same climate. And so the moniker rural cemetery, even though it refers to this picturesque aesthetic, it becomes quite variable across time and space as the rural cemetery as an idea, as an expansive extramural burying ground where there's lots of space, where you have beautiful, lovely landscaping, that it's this park-like atmosphere. Rural cemeteries look very different across the country. So one of my favorite examples is down in New Orleans. And New Orleans is below the water table. There are no hills.
Flat.
It's so flat. You have the very distinctive method of interment in above ground tombs because you don't want watery graves. And yet in 1840, the Firemen's Charitable Association, they established the Firemen's Cemetery, which all of the local press very self-consciously refers to it as a rural cemetery, that it has joined this rural cemetery movement, and it ranks among those in the Northeast. It looks nothing like a rural cemetery. When you think of like Mount Auburn, it looks nothing like that.
Right.
In many ways, it looks a lot more like New Haven's burying ground with the straight carriage paths, and you have rows of family tombs, and yet it's still referred to as a rural cemetery. And so you include it among the rural cemeteries. And then you have places outside of New England that want to model themselves like New England and have to learn that they can't. And that's where we get to Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati. So Spring Grove is established in the mid 1840s, 44, 45. And the founders, they look to Mount Auburn as their model.
Right.
And they hired John Notman, who was the landscape architect who designed Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. And they said, we want our own Laurel Hill or Mount Auburn here with Spring Grove. And Notman, he lays out a plan for the cemetery without really having any clear knowledge of the landscape at all. And he doesn't pay attention to what this land in the environs of Cincinnati looks like. And so he gives them a plan, they pay him, and then they look at it and they go, we don't like that. That doesn't work for us. So they hire a local guy instead, Howard Daniels.
Which maybe they should have done from the beginning, but
Always hire the local guy. So they hire the local landscape architect who knows the land a lot better. And he creates this Byzantine rural cemetery that's just chock full of carriage and footpaths and switchbacks, and it's a very busy, very complicated landscape design. It's easy to get lost in Spring Grove, but they're happy with it. And then in 1850, Daniels, he moves on to other projects. He leaves Cincinnati, and the Prussian landscape architect, Adolf Strauch, he moves into town. And he kind of finagles his way into Spring Grove and says, I've got some different ideas about how this place should look and about how rural cemeteries in general should look. And he gets himself the job of landscape gardener, and he eventually takes over as superintendent of the cemetery. And Strauch, he introduces the idea of the landscape lawn cemetery, where he wants to create a much cleaner, open aesthetic in the rural cemetery, that it's still a rural cemetery, but incorporating what he calls the landscape lawn vision of his.
Right.
So he wants to simplify the landscape in a number of ways. For one, he wants people to get rid of cast iron fences around their lots. Lot owners had started doing this as early as the 1830s, in large part to keep vandals out of their lots.
Right.
because it was actually a problem where people would decorate their lots with flowers and bushes, and then other people would go in and steal the flowers. We still have problems today.
Wait, I was going to say that's
cemetery
still
flowers.
a problem.
But the other thing to keep in mind is that when the rural cemetery model came about, we have the introduction of the idea that when you purchase a lot in a rural cemetery, and this didn't go for the single burial lots. This went for the 300 square foot family lots. When you purchase that, that is your personal real estate. That is your own private property to do with as you see fit. It is not the responsibility of the cemetery to upkeep your lot. It is yours.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore you can put whatever kinds of monuments you want on there, though the trustees reserve the right to have anything removed that they find offensive or really awful. You can plant bushes, you can plant flowers, you can even plant trees on your lot if you want. It's yours.
Mm-hmm.
And so those cast iron fences, they were there for security purposes, but also to demarcate that this is my private property, much like my house or my garden at home.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of tastemakers and social critics hated them. Andrew Jackson Downing notably referred to them as hideous ironmongery. I love his use of language there.
I love it.
They hated it. And Strzok, he really hated the cast iron fences. So he said, we're going to do away with these. No more fences. You can have low posts on the corners to demarcate the lots. And he said, you know, these lots are way too busy with too many monuments. So he wanted to encourage lot holders to have one single family monument and then low individual markers that might say, you know, father, mother, daughter, son on them, no taller than 18 inches. So he wants to create a unified whole, and he wants to create sweeping vistas. So he wants to do away with lot holders really holding the reins on controlling what goes into their lot.
Sure.
He doesn't want people over burdening their lots with flowers and plantings and bushes and trees that might damage the aesthetic whole of the landscape. That it should be the job of the superintendent to lay out the trees in a specific way and to create the whole visual aesthetic of the landscape. So when you look at cemetery maps of Spring Grove post Strzok, you can actually see very clearly the original sections designed by Daniels, which look very, very busy with lots of lots and monuments and paths and everything. Mm-hmm. And then the lower section by Strzok where it's much, much more open. And he hopes that that his idea of the landscape lawn is going to take over as the new dominant style. And it does take some time. He makes his modifications to Spring Grove around 1854, thereabouts. And it's really not until we get into the 1860s, during and after the Civil War, that there starts to be this recognition of, oh, hey, maybe Strzok has a really good idea here. And you have the older rural cemeteries that start modifying their pre-existing landscapes to mimic the new landscape lawn. So even places like Mount Auburn, they start taking down cast iron fences. They start adding new sections with regulations so that it will be designed according to Strzok's principles. But then you have new cemeteries like Woodlawn in the Bronx, mm-hmm. which is established really as kind of like a blended rural cemetery. And the new cemeteries of the 1860s and 70s, they're still calling themselves rural cemeteries. Right. But increasingly, they are designing those landscapes according to the landscape lawn aesthetic, where they're taking away the autonomy of lot holders to do what they want with their lots.
Right.
By the 1880s, we start to see perpetual care contracts coming into being, so that when you purchase a lot, you sign a perpetual care contract. You pay that extra money saying, okay, it's not up to you and the generations after you to take care of your family lot. The cemetery is going to take care of that. But that means you can't just put whatever you want on your lot. You can put up your monument and we'll take care of the rest.
Right.
And so what we really see happening in these latter decades in the 19th century is the landscape lawn really takes hold. This goes hand in hand with the increased professionalization of the role of the cemetery superintendent, who seeks to wrest control away from lot holders.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the earlier ideals of the rural cemetery movement to create the picturesque landscape that mimics the wildness of nature, where you have trees and flora of all kinds all over the place, that it looks like untouched nature, where people have that freedom to design their lots and to put whatever kind of monuments they want, big or small, marble, granite, that they can do whatever that they want, that they can put up lot enclosures and all this stuff. It gets taken away as we get post-Civil War. There is this rejection of the original rural cemetery aesthetic and ideals of it's too chaotic, it's lacking in taste, that it's too busy, and that we want something that is more pleasing and open and ironically more park-like.
But a clean park.
A very clean park. And what I always find really hilarious about this shift that's taking place is Frederick Law Olmsted, he makes a name for himself by designing New York Central Park.
Right.
In the 1850s. And Central Park is really the first major public park that is designed strictly to serve as a pleasure ground.
Mm-hmm.
Because Olmsted, he looked at rural cemeteries and he thought about, well, we need to separate these functions. Cemeteries need to be cemeteries. Pleasure grounds need to be pleasure grounds. We can't keep combining the two together, because that's where we have a lot of the root of a lot of our problems here.
Right.
Over public misbehavior and people not knowing how to comport themselves in cemeteries. So we got to put a crowbar there and separate the two. And because of his work on Central Park, he gets hired by the folks in Oakland, California, to design Mountain View Cemetery in the 1860s. And he really is very articulate about how, you need to think hard about what is the function of the cemetery, that it needs to be function over form. It needs to be a cemetery first and foremost, and then it can be beautiful, but beauty, that comes second. And you have to take into consideration things like climate, topography, all these other things, weather patterns. Otherwise, if you design according to, you want it to look like it's in New England, but you're in California, you're going to have a cemetery where things are going to go haywire. But
some of those trees that they have in New England don't grow as well out here in our dry climates.
But that whole idea of separating the functions, everybody else in the cemetery business ignores Olmsted. And by the 1870s and 1880s, it's more a matter of, well, we have pleasure grounds, we have parks, but we also want the cemeteries to be more park-like. We want them to be more open. We want them to be more beautiful rather than picturesque. So, curving lines rather than a sense of wildness and sublimity. We want it to be pleasing and calming and pleasurable. We certainly don't want anybody to have negative associations like of grief and mourning and melancholy while walking through these. So it's very much about taking control over the cemetery landscape. And I would say, going so far as to say, sanitizing the cemetery landscape by the last decades of the 19th century. What's happening with the takeover of the landscape lawn aesthetic, it goes hand in hand with the emergence of the progressive era and progressive reform, where you have these progressive era reformers that are trying to reform the cities to make them cleaner and healthier. And we can look at the landscape lawn cemetery as an offshoot of that, where they want it to be a cleaner aesthetic, that they want it to be more open, that they don't want any riffraff, whereas the earlier rural cemeteries, you could purchase those single burial lots for relatively cheap. And a number of rural cemeteries even had, potter's fields out in the back.
Right.
The newer landscape lawn cemeteries, there's none of that. So you look at the new generations of cemeteries like Conseco Hills in New York or Druid Ridge Cemetery in Pikesville, Maryland, and you could see that these are very clearly elite burial spaces.
Right.
You might have, middle class folks could purchase smaller lots, but definitely no lower than the respectable middle class. Your working class people are not being buried there. Your paupers are definitely not being buried there. They disappear. And one irony is of this is that during the height of the rural cemetery movement, people commented on these are elite burying grounds that highlight our industrial capitalist elite with their large monuments and large lots and everything.
Right.
But they still incorporated spaces for those on the margins of society. No one's pretending to be inclusive by the end of the 19th century anymore.
You are either this, or this.
Exactly. And there's a big deal about the newer cemeteries in the 1880s and 1890s. They're being established even further outside of the main cities. So whereas the rural cemeteries, they're being located 2, 3, 4 miles outside of the city center where you could possibly walk to them, but you could also easily get to them by horse and buggy or even, once omnibuses become a thing.
Right.
By the time we get to the 1880s and 1890s, the new batch of cemeteries, they're located more like 10, 15 miles outside of the cities. You got to take a train to get to them. And a lot of the new cemeteries were actually including cemetery train depots right next to the entrance of the cemetery. So the cemetery would actually make a stop. The train would make a stop at the cemetery. And you could get off and go and tour around, or that's how funerals would get to the cemeteries as well.
Right.
Load up the casket, load up the mourners and the train.
Everybody on the train and let's go.
Everybody on the train and head out to the cemetery. So they're really becoming more focused on that element of distance, of utilizing modern transportation to get there, and they use the language of ease of access. It's further away, but it's going to be easy for people to get here. But if you are an industrial factory worker who maybe gets Sundays off, you're not taking the train 15 miles out of the city to walk through the cemetery. Whereas in the 1830s, you have Lowell mill girls who on their time off would walk out to Mount Auburn. And then they would write about how beautiful the cemetery was in their self-published newspaper, the Lowell Offering.
Right.
So that during the 1830s and 1840s, the industrial working class, the factory and mill workers, they're able to get out there. They're able to enjoy those spaces the same as middle class and elite folks. By the end of the century, really, it's only the middle and upper class people that are going out to the cemeteries to hang out or for funerals. So it's not just a matter of sanitizing the landscape. It's really culling who gets to go there.
Right.
Not just who gets to be buried there, but who actually gets to physically go and
be in this space.
Be in that space.
It goes right along with the aesthetics of the whole thing. You don't want those poor, dirty people in your clean, perfect cemetery.
No unwashed riffraff.
Right.
No negative emotions or sensations. I'm trying to remember which cemetery it was. I know that I talk about it in the chapter, but I had to cut it out of my conference presentation because it was like, okay, I've got a 47-page chapter and I need a 10-page conference. But one of the new landscape lawn cemeteries, and really by the end of the 1880s, they weren't calling themselves rural cemeteries anymore. They were now calling themselves either landscape lawn or lawn cemeteries.
Right.
But one of them, it might have been Druid Ridge in Maryland, where the newspaper article talking about the dedication day ceremony to formally open it up, they talked about all the entertainment on hand, the singing and the bands and the food, and that basically everybody here today is going to have a wonderful time. Whereas for cemetery consecrations and dedications during the rural cemetery movement, there's a much greater emphasis on, the solemn ceremonies to dedicate this as a space for the use of the dead.
Right.
That kind of language really dissipates by the end of the cemetery. And when we look at the long history of American burial spaces. The lawn cemetery really serves as this fulcrum, really a hinge between the rural cemetery of the middle decades of the century and then the memorial park of the 20th century. We can see that evolution, or for some of us, perhaps devolution, taking place, where the cemetery becomes much less like a cemetery. It becomes much less associated with death and the burial of the dead. And by the time we get to the memorial park idea of the early 20th century, with flush markers and perfect landscaping and open lawns and very strategically planted trees and all this other stuff, the prevailing idea of the memorial garden itself was, we don't want people to think about death while they're here.
Even though this is where we're putting all our dead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the lawn cemetery really serves as a very critical part in this movement towards eliminating death from the landscapes of the dead.
That's a good way to put it.
Yes. Yes. And I found it absolutely fascinating to look at that transition, because the rural cemeteries, the original rural cemeteries, very many of them continued to operate. They continued to expand their borders to add acreage, but their newer sections, in order to stay relevant, in order to keep getting people to purchase lots, the newer sections were designed according to what was newly popular. So in places like Mount Auburn or Greenwood, and elsewhere around the country, Cave Hill and Louisville, Kentucky, for example, they're adding landscape lawn sections. Later on in the 20th century, they're adding memorial park sections with flush to the ground markers. So now we look at these cemeteries today, and we can actually see that evolution over time in those cemeteries, that as they continued to operate and they tried very hard to stay relevant, they incorporated new technologies. They added paving to their roads. They added running water, and fountains that, would have spouts of water coming out of them and everything. You have a lot of cemeteries that are really focusing on, okay, what kind of buildings can we put here for the comfort of visitors? So you have new structures that are being built. When the community mausoleum movement starts to emerge at the end of the 19th and in the 20th centuries, rural cemeteries, they start building community mausoleums to house the dead in these above ground structures as a middle-class alternative to the private family mausoleum that became really popular in the post-Civil War years, but were super expensive. Then as cremation becomes increasingly popular, now you have rural cemeteries. Okay, we're going to include a columbarium so that people can put their cremains in a structure, or we'll start selling smaller lots for the burial of cremains. So these rural cemeteries that survive up to the present day, they are constantly reinventing themselves. They are constantly working to retain relevance over the course of time. And many of them now are, they're on National Register of Historic Places. These are protected cemeteries. They have endowments, they have friends groups to raise money, but not every rural cemetery survived. There were those that, their planners at the time thought, for example, okay, let's take Philadelphia for an example. Laurel Hill Cemetery was about 4.5 miles outside of downtown Philly. It wasn't that easy to get to on foot. So the founders of Monument Cemetery, they put Monument Cemetery practically in downtown Philly. For most people, it was at most a mile and a half walk to get to Monument Cemetery.
So easy to get to.
And it was established very shortly after Laurel Hill, and it was going to be, the city's second rural cemetery. It was going to be more convenient. And it was going to be, just as popular and just as beautiful, but, at a better location. Monument Cemetery no longer exists. It completely disappeared.
Wow.
And photographer Ed Snyder, he has done a wonderful job documenting what happened to Monument Cemetery. So basically it was full by the late 1920s, early 1930s. And essentially the local university, and I'm, it's off the top of my head, it's flown right out of my mind. They wanted to shut it down and basically empty out the cemetery so that they could use that real estate. It was prime real estate in downtown Philly.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually they were able to have the city condemn it because they said, well, we've got, broken monuments and rundown monuments and monuments that have fallen over. And they convinced the city to shut down Monument Cemetery. And there were some newspaper notices saying, if you've got family buried here, come claim them. Otherwise, everybody's going to be emptied out and the bodies are going to be exhumed and they're going to be reinterred at such and such a cemetery. And some people did. They went and claimed family members and monuments, but the vast majority were not. And so the bodies were exhumed. And as far as I know, they were put in a mass grave in another local Philadelphia cemetery. And then the monuments were very unceremoniously dumped over the embankment of the Delaware River. And that's where they remain today. At low tide, you can see the monuments.
Wow.
And Ed has photographed this extensively, but the landscape of the original cemetery is now a parking lot for the university that wanted that land. Ironically, the founder of the university had been buried at Monument Cemetery.
Oh, geez.
Yep. And so you have that case, and then you also have, this is a story that we hear over and over and over again. African American burying grounds historically always targeted for destruction, for urban development. They're going to pave over it, and you have Black rural cemeteries of the 19th century that eventually they became overcrowded. They were targeted by grave robbers. You have urban development and urban planning issues, and they become defunct and then just wiped off the map. So Laurel Cemetery in Baltimore essentially faced that history where by the mid 20th century it had changed hands. It was no longer financially viable, but it had been established in the 1850s as Black Baltimore's response to the rural cemetery movement, with all the same ideals and principles and landscaping ideas behind it. And it eventually got paved over, and there are, I think, department stores and fast food restaurants on top of where it used to be. And whether or not the bodies are still there, that's still up for debate.
It seems like in a lot of those cases, for the Black cemetery specifically, they left the bodies.
Oh yeah. They weren't going to go through the labor.
Yeah, I feel like we keep discovering these cemeteries under these businesses and these roadways and stuff. Somebody goes to do work and they're like, oh, this is where this Black cemetery is located, and we found the bodies. Ugh, breaks my heart every time.
And it's surprising, maybe it's not surprising, how often these older cemeteries, there wasn't as much an emphasis on, we need to make sure we move these bodies. Right. So I'm thinking about at the conference, were you at Krista Horrocks's presentation about the excavations in Columbus, Ohio? So
I missed that one.
The old burying ground there in Columbus, for whatever reason, they had exhumed a bunch of bodies, but not all of the bodies. And so in doing the excavations, they're finding close to 1,000 burial shafts of people that were never exhumed. So now they're having to go through the process of excavation and exhuming these bodies to get them moved out of there, because there's this development that's supposed to take place.
Oh, geez. That happened here in Colorado, in Denver. Our original city cemetery, when they decided to move it out to Riverside and then also Fairmount, they began exhuming bodies, but the person that was actually hired to be in charge of the exhumations started combining bones and started to fill certain coffins because of the way he was getting paid. And then they discovered that the bodies weren't being properly moved. So eventually they just ceased, and they just were like, you know what, we're going to leave who's here. Now, in this case, there's not a parking lot or whatever. They did turn it into a park. So it's Cheeseman Park. It was Congress Park. Now it's Cheeseman Park. And also our gardens are over parts of that cemetery too. But every time they excavate something over there anymore, they still tend to find some of the bodies that have been left behind, because they just decided, you know what, we've moved enough. It's fine. We'll just do what we're going to do. They just took out all the monuments. But yeah, there's still a lot of bodies buried in that section of Denver that a lot of people aren't even aware of exist under the park like that, but they're there. The botanical gardens and the park.
It really happens everywhere. I think one of the first really big ones that made like national news was back in the early 1990s when they were doing excavations in New York and they found the African burying ground.
I remember that.
And this was where, you know, enslaved Africans and African Americans had been buried since, you know, the 18th century.
Right.
And all of a sudden they just start finding all of these bodies. It's like, we're going to stop whatever the, you know, the development plans were, because we got to figure out how many bodies are here of you know, this African burying ground that, because they were enslaved, because they were marginalized, well, nobody really cared. So that's the long history really of African and African American burials here in the United States, where, you know, you have instances of predominantly white cemeteries and burying grounds getting bulldozed or destroyed, like Monument Cemetery, but for every one of those you've got countless other African American burying grounds that were lost to the sands of time and urban development.
Well, and the frustrating part about for me at least, the most frustrating part about all of that is not the loss of the cemetery. Hurts, obviously, when we think of it, but we lose all those stories. Then those stories especially were not as well documented as the white cemetery stories. We know that because they're, until, you know, they just weren't able to document them, and they didn't all read and write, and they didn't all have those documentations. So by losing the cemeteries, we lose a lot of their stories and a lot of their history. And it's so frustrating that there's no way to really get that back either. We don't have a way to study that and learn that now.
I will say this, that, you know, there does seem to be a major increase in attention paid to historic African American cemeteries and burying grounds, and there's a lot of advocacy groups and friends groups that have emerged in order to try and rehabilitate surviving cemeteries that are perhaps in disrepair, but also to find those that are lost. So like archaeologist Lynn Rainville, she's done an enormous amount of work in Virginia locating slave burying grounds. And trying to find what might possibly remain for any kinds of markers, but also locations on former plantation grounds. In where I live and work in York, Pennsylvania, we have the historical Black cemetery, Lebanon Cemetery, which is right near the large, predominantly white Prospect Hill rural cemetery. And Lebanon was established in the 1870s, so it really kind of falls in that transitional period.
Right.
And there is a fabulous Friends of Lebanon Cemetery group that is very active in terms of cleaning grave markers and probing the ground for sunken grave markers and doing grave marker restoration and things like that. But this is an uphill thing where it really varies from community to community.
Right.
And you know, what records still exist for lost burying grounds and things like that. I know we kind of veered off the initial topic. But...
No, that's okay. We do that a lot on this show, so it's totally fine. we have a habit of doing that, but it's okay. One thing leads to another, and that's the thing about the cemeteries. You know, you're talking about, I love making the connection when you were talking about how from the original rural cemetery movement, how it was supposed to be this eclectic, everybody picks their own thing, they make it look how they want it to look. And then as we get later in the century, it becomes more uniform, you know, more pleasing to the eye. But if you think about it, the history from the Victorian era up through even past the Edwardian era, that's how everything seemed to move in that time period. You know, the Victorians were very, like you said, they could be very morbid. They had different ideas on death and how to mourn and what they did. And they had very specific mourning rituals. And as the century progressed, a lot of that started to fall away and become more simplified. And people kind of, I don't want to say mocked the traditions, but they were moving away from them. As the next generation came about, they said, okay, we don't need this stuff anymore. We don't need to be so dark and morbid. We want it to be more clean. And their clothing was that way. The way they built and decorated their homes was that way. So it makes sense that the cemeteries followed suit as far as how they were laid out and how we decorated our plots and how we did all of that. It all kind of falls in line with that same sort of ideals of the population at the various times throughout that century.
Yeah, I think in many ways it really becomes much more restrained.
Mm-hmm.
Because even by the end of the 19th century, you still have social strictures like, the wearing of black for widows, for example, and you have a lot of the rules and regulations for grief and mourning and the expectations of people. But at the same time, I think there's less of a sense of freedom for unrestrained grief,
right,
that you see earlier in the century. So you might be in mourning, but you have to be much more stoic and restrained about it.
right.
And the cemetery becomes a place where whatever grief or mourning you feel, the cemetery is less of the space for that to take place. Perhaps you're going to express your grief more at home rather than at the cemetery, because if people see a grieving widow at the cemetery, then they might start thinking about death.
Where we're putting our dead people, but
right.
That's okay.
And we don't want that.
Right.
Yeah.
We don't want to think about death in the cemetery.
Oh, goodness, no. Doesn't exist.
But really, when we look at the popularization of landscape lawn and the rise in professionalization of superintendents, that parallels the rise in professionalization of the undertaker, who restyles himself as the funeral director. And so, especially in urban areas of the country, you have the outsourcing of death care. So
Right.
the processes of caring for the dead that always took place at home, the washing of the body, the dressing of the body, the laying out of the body in the home
Right.
before the funeral. You had your friends or family building a coffin and so on and so forth. All of that stuff that took place in the home becomes increasingly outsourced to the undertaker, who brings the dead body to his place of business, who, with the advent of embalming, is going to embalm the body and do all of the washing and dressing and display, selling the family a casket, providing the hearse, providing all of those services, so that there is that distancing that takes place between the living and the dead. And of course, this is not uniform everywhere.
Right.
Abby Burnett, in her book Gone to the Grave, about death and funerals in the Arkansas Ozarks, she shows how well into the 20th century in these rural areas, families, they're still taking care of the dead,
right,
in a family and communal way well into the 20th century. So it's not a uniform process. But if you live in larger towns or in cities, the living by the end of the 19th century are increasingly being displaced from the dead and caring for the dead. And then you also have, further running in parallel, hospitals in the medical field finally embracing germ theory and antiseptic techniques, and hospitals became places of healing by the end of the century. And they also increasingly become the space where the terminally ill go to die outside of the home. So
Right.
You also have that transition of death outside of the home, so that the process of death itself is being outsourced to the hospital, to the care of doctors at the bedside, rather
Right.
than having your whole extended family and your community in your house watching you in your last moments. Now it's really out of your hands. And so if you have the individuals dying outside of the home, and then you have professional undertakers taking control of the dead body, and you have cemetery superintendents who are controlling the landscape of death, we can see how Americans, especially urban Americans of the late 19th century, there is that widening of the space between the living and the dead.
Right.
And with the era's emphasis on sanitation and cleanliness, that progressive era emphasis, we can see how people increasingly are rejecting what to them had become the chaotic, altogether too eclectic spaces of the rural cemeteries of the mid-19th century.
Mm-hmm.
So that there is very little in terms of public resistance to the landscape lawn cemetery and to the control of superintendents, because it's an interconnected part of a much larger whole.
Right.
Of what's happening in terms of the process of death and dying and care for the dead. They're all connected.
It's so fascinating.
I know you think about it, because I'm thinking about like our cemetery, which the cemetery that I volunteer at was established in 1870, and it followed the rural cemetery movement as far as it could out here in Colorado, and the reason I was on my phone a little bit, Olmsted, that you mentioned, his sons who took over the business after he died actually landscape designed the grounds of the Broadmoor Hotel and the Spencer Penrose house, and I believe they had part in landscaping our Monument Valley Park. So I think Colorado Springs had a lot of that back east influence into the cemetery, which listening to your information is like, I realize how very important and special Evergreen Cemetery is to that history, even though we're sort of on the very fringe and then the end of it. It makes so much sense seeing how it has evolved in the different aspects, because we have two sections that are flush grave markers, and it makes it easy for maintenance. But those stones sink, and it's just very, very interesting, because I could see the evolution in our own cemetery, which is only 200 acres.
Yeah. And during the 1860s and 70s, as Eastern cemeteries are starting to think about incorporating the landscape lawn aesthetic, you look further west, you look west of the Mississippi, and you have a lot of these communities that are exiting the frontier status, and they're going, well, to be more modern, to be more civilized, to be more polished as a community, we have to have a rural cemetery. And they're very, very specific about using that language of, we need to establish a rural cemetery. What a rural cemetery looks like in Colorado Springs looks very different from what one looks like in Omaha, Nebraska versus,
Right.
Portland, Oregon. And yet they're all thinking this way of, okay, we are no longer a frontier town. We're no longer going to have just, the pioneer burying ground. We have to have something much more polished. And to join this community of modern Americans, we need to have a rural cemetery. And this becomes a real priority. And it shows how important a cultural institution the rural cemetery was, because to have a rural cemetery meant that your community was civilized, that your community was modern.
Right.
That you weren't just some, podunk little backwater town still relying on overcrowded burying grounds or churchyards.
Right. Oh, it's so fascinating. Well, Joy, thank you so much for joining us. Your book comes out next year. Do you have the title of it yet, or?
So the new book is Pleasure Grounds of Death, The Rural Cemetery in 19th Century America. And it is currently slated to be available in fall 2024 from University of Michigan Press.
Cool.
Well, hopefully we can have you on again, hopefully closer to the date, and you can tell us some more, maybe pick another section of the book and enlighten us even more. It's been absolutely fascinating having you on the show today. So thank you for taking time out of your summer break to join us and chat with us today. We appreciate it.
I would absolutely love to come back, and it's been my pleasure to be here today. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for sharing these stories with us today. Please visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, if you would like us to share the stories of your favorite cemeteries, or if you are interested in being a guest on the podcast, send us an email to the link on the website.
Or you can contact us on social media. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery and on Twitter at OrdExtraSim. We truly love to hear from all of you and appreciate your feedback. If you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, please consider leaving a 5-star review and a comment on Apple Podcasts or directly on our website.
Thank you. Until we meet again.